June 28, 2024, the day the dominoes started falling again. I was in a secure briefing room in Washington when the news broke. Not the kind of place where you get breaking alerts on your phone, this was the kind where the screens flicker with classified updates, or analysts in rolled-up sleeves lean forward when the room goes quiet. The State Department had just announced a new round of sanctions against Venezuela, targeting not just Nicolas Maduro's inner circle but the country's entire oil sector, effectively cutting off its last lifeline to the global market. The official statement called it a measured response to electoral fraud and human rights abuses. The media ran with it. The New York Times called it a firm but prudent step. The Washington Post framed it as restoring democracy's credibility in Latin America. Even some of the usual skeptics in Congress nodded along, muttering about finally holding dictators accountable. But here's what no one in that room said out: this wasn't a measured response. It was the opening move in a playbook we've run before. And if history is any guide, we're about to make the same catastrophic mistake again. I've spent the last 30 years studying American foreign policy, first as a Pentagon analyst, then as an academic, and now as someone who gets pulled into these rooms when the stakes are high. And let me tell you, when the US starts talking about restoring democracy in a country sitting on the world's largest oil reserves, you should reach for your wallet and your history books. Because what's happening in Venezuela right now isn't about democracy. It's about power. And we're repeating the same fatal error we made in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, assuming that economic strangulation and regime change will produce stability, rather than chaos. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big one. The official what they want you to believe. The White House's case is straightforward, almost seductive in its simplicity. Venezuela, we're told, is a failed state run by a corrupt dictator who stole an election, brutalized his people, and turned a once prosperous nation into a humanitarian disaster. The US has a moral obligation to act. The sanctions, the administration argues, are targeted and smart, designed to squeeze Maduro's regime without hurting ordinary Venezuelans. The goal? To force free and fair elections, restore democracy, and implicitly bring Venezuela back into the Western fold. The numbers seem to back this up. According to the U.S. Treasury, Maduro's government has overseen the collapse of Venezuela's economy, with GDP shrinking by 75% since 2013. Hyperinflation has rendered the bolivar worthless. More than 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country, creating one of the worst refugee crises in the world. The UN reports widespread human rights abuses, including arbitrary detentions and torture. And then there's the 2024 election, widely condemned by the US and its allies as a sham, with opposition candidates barred from running and voting irregularities reported across the country. The media has amplified this narrative. CNN runs segments on Venezuela's descent into dictatorship. The Economist calls Maduro a thug clinging to power. Even left-leaning outlets like The Guardian have framed the crisis as a cautionary tale about socialism's failures. And the political class in Washington? They're united in their condemnation. Democrats and Republicans alike have called for tougher action. Senator Marco Rubio has been particularly vocal, tweeting that Maduro must go and urging the Biden administration to finish the job started under Trump. But here's where it gets interesting. Because if you dig beneath the surface, past the press releases, past the talking points, past the carefully curated images of empty supermarket shelves and tear-gassed protesters, you find a story that's far more complicated. And far more dangerous. The hidden what's really happening in Venezuela. Let's start with the sanctions. The US government calls them targeted, but the data tells a different story. A 2022 study by the Center for Economic and Policy Research found that US sanctions on Venezuela have been anything but precise. Between 2017 and 2021, they contributed to the deaths of at least 40,000 Venezuelans by restricting access to food, medicine, and basic goods. The sanctions didn't just hit Maduro's cronies, they crippled the entire economy. Oil production, Venezuela's lifeblood, collapsed from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998 to just 700,000 in 2023. The country's refineries, starved of investment in spare parts, now operate at a fraction of their capacity. And the humanitarian crisis? It didn't start with Maduro. It accelerated after the US began its economic war. Now, I'm not here to defend Maduro. His government has been authoritarian, corrupt, and incompetent. But let's be the US didn't impose sanctions to save Venezuelans. It imposed them to force regime change. And that's where the story gets even darker. In 2019, the Trump administration recognized Juan Guaidó, a little-known opposition figure, as Venezuela's interim president. The move was legally dubious. Guaidó had never won a national election, but it was politically brilliant. The US froze Venezuela's assets, handed control of its oil company to Guaidó's team, and pressured allies to do the same. The goal was to starve Maduro of resources and force him out. It didn't work. Maduro held on, Guaidó's support collapsed, and Venezuela's crisis deepened. But here's what the mainstream media isn't telling: the US has been trying to overthrow Maduro for years, and it's not just about democracy. It's about oil. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, bigger than Saudi Arabia's. And in a world where energy security is becoming a national security priority, control over those reserves is a geopolitical prize. The US isn't the only player here. Russia and China have been propping up Maduro for years. Moscow has sent military advisors, supplied weapons, and invested billions in Venezuela's oil sector. Beijing has extended billions in loans, secured by future oil deliveries. Both see Venezuela as a strategic foothold in America's backyard, a way to challenge US dominance in Latin America. And that's where the real game is being played. The geopolitical why Venezuela matters. Let me put this in context: the US is in the middle of a global power struggle with Russia and China. It's not a Cold War 2.0, it's something more fluid, more dangerous. The US still sees itself as the world's sole superpower, but its grip is slipping. China is rising, Russia is resurgent, and the global South is increasingly asserting its independence. The unipolar moment, the brief period after the Cold War when the US could act with impunity, is over. Venezuela is a microcosm of this struggle. For the US, it's about maintaining hegemony in its own hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine, the 19th century policy that declared Latin America off-limits to European powers, is still alive and well in Washington. The US sees Latin America as its sphere of influence, and it doesn't tolerate rivals. That's why the US has a long history of intervening in the region, from the Bay of Pigs to the coup in Chile to the Contra War in Nicaragua. Russia and China, meanwhile, see Venezuela as an opportunity. Moscow wants to project power beyond its borders, and Venezuela gives it a base in the Western Hemisphere. China wants access to Venezuela's oil and a foothold in a region where the US has traditionally dominated. Both see the US as a declining power, and they're happy to exploit its weaknesses. This is where the hypocrisy comes in. The US condemns Russia for invading Ukraine, but it has no problem imposing crippling sanctions on Venezuela, a sovereign nation. It accuses China of undermining democracy, but it has a long history of supporting dictators in Latin America when it suits its interests. And it talks about the rule of law, but it has repeatedly violated international law in its pursuit of regime change. The truth is, the US is trying to have it both ways. It wants to be the global policeman, but it doesn't want to play by the rules. And that's a dangerous game. The military: what happens if the US escalates? Now, let's talk about the military angle. Because if the US decides to double down on regime change, things could get ugly fast. The US already has a significant military presence in the region. There are roughly 2,000 US troops in Colombia, a key ally in the anti-Maduro coalition. The US Southern Command has been conducting joint exercises with regional partners, including Brazil and Guyana. And there have been reports of US Special Forces operating in Venezuela's border regions, training opposition groups. But here's the: Venezuela isn't Iraq or Afghanistan. It's not a weak state with a divided population. It's a country with a battle-hardened military, a loyal security apparatus, and the backing of two major powers, Russia and China. If the US were to launch a military intervention, it wouldn't be a quick and easy operation. It would be a prolonged, bloody conflict with no clear exit strategy. And let's not forget the lessons of the past. The US invaded Iraq in 2003 with the promise of a quick victory. It ended up in a decade-long quagmire that cost trillions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of lives. Libya in 2011 was supposed to be a humanitarian intervention. It turned into a failed state and a haven for terrorists. Afghanistan? 20 years of war, and the Taliban is back in power. The hawks in Washington will tell you that Venezuela is different. That Maduro is weak, that the people will rise up, that the military will defect. But I've heard that before. And I've seen how it ends. The domestic why this is happening now. So why is the US pushing so hard on Venezuela right now? The answer, as always, is politics. The 2024 election is looming, and both parties are looking for ways to rally their bases. For Republicans, Venezuela is a way to attack Biden as weak on dictators. For Democrats, it's a way to show they're tough on foreign policy. And in Florida, a key swing state with a large Venezuelan exile community, being seen as pro-democracy is a political winner. But there's more to it than that. The US has a long history of using foreign policy to distract from domestic problems. When the economy is struggling, when scandals are brewing, when the president's approval ratings are tanking, suddenly, there's a crisis abroad that demands attention. Venezuela is the perfect distraction. It's far enough away that most Americans won't feel the consequences, but it's close enough to home that it feels urgent. And let's not forget the role of the military-industrial complex. Every time the US gets involved in a foreign conflict, defense contractors make billions. The Pentagon gets bigger budgets. The intelligence agencies get more funding. And the revolving door between government and industry spins faster. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's how the system works. The what comes next. So where does this go from here? Let's game out the possibilities. Scenario 1, the best case outcome. The US dials back the pressure, engages in quiet diplomacy, and allows for a negotiated transition. Maduro steps down, free elections are held, and Venezuela begins the long process of rebuilding. The sanctions are lifted, the economy stabilizes, and the country reintegrates into the global system. This is the outcome the Biden administration claims it wants. But it's also the least likely. Maduro has no incentive to step down, and the US has no interest in a negotiated solution that leaves him in power. The best-case scenario is a fantasy. Scenario 2, the most likely outcome. The US continues its current strategy: sanctions, diplomatic pressure, covert support for the opposition. Maduro clings to power, but the country's crisis deepens. Russia and China increase their support, turning Venezuela into a proxy battleground. The humanitarian situation worsens, more refugees flee, and the region becomes increasingly unstable. This is the slow-motion disaster scenario. It's not a war, but it's not peace either. It's a grinding, endless crisis that drains resources, fuels resentment, and does nothing to improve the lives of ordinary Venezuelans. Scenario 3, the worst-case outcome. The US escalates. It imposes a naval blockade, freezes all Venezuelan assets, and begins direct military support for opposition groups. Maduro responds by cracking down harder, arresting dissidents, and leaning even more on Russia and China. The situation spirals out of control. There are border clashes, cyber attacks, even limited military engagements. The US finds itself bogged down in another endless conflict, this time in its own backyard. This is the scenario that keeps me up at night. Because once the shooting starts, there's no going back. The grand strategy why the US keeps making the same mistake. Here's the hard: the US is repeating the same mistake it's made for decades. It's trying to maintain a global order that no longer exists. After the Cold War, the US became the world's sole superpower. It had no rivals, no constraints. It could invade countries, impose sanctions, overthrow governments, all with impunity. But that era is over. The world is multipolar now. China is rising. Russia is resurgent. The global south is asserting its independence. And the US is still acting like it's 1999. This is the fatal flaw in American grand strategy. The US believes in liberal hegemony, the idea that it can and should remake the world in its own image. But liberal hegemony is unsustainable. It's too expensive, too destabilizing, too hubristic. And it's leading the US into one disaster after another. Look at the last 20 years. The US invaded Iraq to spread democracy. It got chaos. It intervened in Libya to protect civilians. It got a failed state. It spent trillions in Afghanistan to build a nation. It got the Taliban. And now it's doing the same thing in Venezuela, assuming that economic pressure and regime change will produce stability, rather than collapse. This isn't realism. It's imperial overreach. What the US should do instead. So what's the alternative? Here's what I'd tell the White House if they'd 1. Stop the economic war. The sanctions aren't working. They're hurting ordinary Venezuelans, not Maduro. And they're pushing Venezuela into the arms of Russia and China. The US should lift the sanctions, allow Venezuela to sell its oil, and let the country begin the process of economic recovery. 2. Engage in diplomacy, not regime change. The US should open direct talks with Maduro's government. Not to legitimize him, but to find a way out of the crisis. The goal should be a negotiated transition, not a forced one. And the US should work with regional partners, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, to find a solution that doesn't involve military intervention. 3. Accept that Venezuela is not a US colony. The Monroe Doctrine is dead. The US can't dictate what happens in Latin America anymore. It needs to accept that Venezuela has the right to choose its own government, even if that government is hostile to US interests. And it needs to stop treating the region as its backyard. 4. Focus on stability, not ideology. The US has a habit of supporting democracy when it suits its interests and ignoring it when it doesn't. That's not a strategy. It's hypocrisy. The US should focus on stability, on preventing a humanitarian catastrophe, on stopping the flow of refugees, on avoiding a regional war. And it should do that by working with all parties, not just the ones it likes. This isn't a radical idea. It's basic realism. But in Washington, realism is often the first casualty of politics. The bottom America's fatal flaw. Here's the central: the US is repeating the same mistake it's made for decades. It's assuming that it can reshape the world in its own image, that it can impose its will through force, that it can ignore the laws of geopolitics. But the world has changed. The unipolar moment is over. And the US is still acting like it's the only game in town. Venezuela is the latest example of this fatal flaw. The US sees a crisis, and it reaches for the same old tools: sanctions, regime change, military threats. But those tools don't work anymore. They haven't worked in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria. And they won't work in Venezuela. The tragedy is that the US has the power to do good in the world. It has the resources, the influence, the soft power. But it keeps squandering that power on misguided adventures, on endless wars, on futile attempts to turn back the clock. The question: how many more times will we make the same mistake before we learn? A final warning. I've been studying this for decades. I've seen the same patterns repeat themselves, over and over. And I can tell you the US is on a collision course with reality. The longer it clings to the illusion of hegemony, the worse the crash will be. Venezuela is just the latest chapter in this story. But it doesn't have to be the last. The US can still change course. It can still choose diplomacy over war, engagement over isolation, realism over ideology. But it won't happen unless the American people demand it. So pay attention. Ask questions. Challenge the narratives. Because in the end, the only thing that can stop the march to disaster is an informed, engaged citizenry. And right now, that's our only hope. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela isn't just another crisis in a far-off land, it's a strategic flashpoint where the US is sleepwalking into a military confrontation it doesn't want and can't win. The Pentagon knows this. The intelligence community knows this. But the political class in Washington keeps pushing the same tired playbook, as if the last 20 years of failure in the Middle East never happened. Let me explain why this matters. Venezuela sits at the crossroads of the Western Hemisphere, a country with the world's largest proven oil reserves, a long Caribbean coastline, and a government that has spent the last decade deepening its ties with Russia, China, and Iran. That last part isn't just rhetoric, it's geopolitical reality. Moscow has sent Wagner Group mercenaries to train Venezuelan forces. Beijing has extended billions in loans, secured by oil, while building a satellite tracking station in the Andes. And Tehran has used Caracas as a hub for its shadow fleet of oil tankers, evading U.S. sanctions. This isn't some abstract axis of evil. It's a network of alliances that directly challenges American influence in what the U.S. has long considered its backyard. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. military is not postured for a war in Venezuela. Not even close. The Pentagon's 2022 National Defense Strategy made it clear China is the pacing threat, Russia is the acute challenge, and the Middle East is a secondary theater. Latin America barely registers. And yet, here we are, with the U.S. Southern Command stretched thin, its resources diverted to countering cartels and managing migration, while the White House keeps ratcheting up the pressure on Maduro with sanctions that only push him closer to Moscow and Beijing. I've spoken to senior officers in the region, and the consensus is grim. They'll tell you, off the record, that a direct military intervention in Venezuela would be a logistical nightmare. The country's terrain, dense jungles, towering mountains, and sprawling urban centers, is tailor-made for asymmetric warfare. The Venezuelan military, while poorly equipped, is battle-hardened from years of suppressing internal dissent and has been trained by Russian and Iranian advisors. And then there's the political cost. The U.S. hasn't forgotten the Bay of Pigs, but it seems to have forgotten the lessons of Grenada in 1983, when a quick, decisive operation still left scars on America's reputation in the region. But the real danger isn't just the military calculus, it's the way the U.S. keeps misreading the signals from its adversaries. Take Russia, for example. In 2019, when Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president with U.S. backing, Moscow didn't just sit on the sidelines. It sent 2 nuclear-capable Tu-160 bombers to Caracas in a show of force, a move that was as much about testing U.S. resolve as it was about supporting Maduro. The message was Venezuela is now part of Russia's global chessboard, and the U.S. doesn't get to move the pieces unilaterally. China, meanwhile, has been playing the long game. Since 2007, Beijing has loaned Venezuela over $60 billion, most of it collateralized by oil. When Maduro defaulted, China didn't cut its losses, it doubled down, restructuring the debt and deepening its economic footprint. Today, Chinese commies control critical infrastructure, from ports to power plants, and Beijing has made it clear that any U.S. military action would be met with economic retaliation. That's not an idle threat. China holds over $1 trillion in U.S. debt, and it's not afraid to use its financial leverage. And then there's Iran. The Islamic Republic has turned Venezuela into a forward operating base for its proxy networks, using the country's porous borders to move weapons, personnel, and even drones. In 2020, the U.S. seized 4 Iranian tankers bound for Venezuela, only to see Tehran retaliate by sending its own flotilla of fuel tankers, escorted by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. This wasn't just about oil, it was a demonstration of Iran's ability to project power thousands of miles from its borders, right into America's sphere of influence. So what happens when the U.S. keeps pushing, and Maduro keeps digging in? We've seen this movie before. In 1961, the Kennedy administration backed the Bay of Pigs invasion, only to see it collapse in humiliation. In 1983, Reagan ordered the invasion of Grenada, a small island nation, and still faced global condemnation. In 2002, the Bush administration tacitly supported a coup against Hugo Chavez, which failed spectacularly and left the U.S. looking weak and indecisive. Each time, the U.S. assumed that its overwhelming power would carry the day. Each time, it miscalculated. The difference now is that the stakes are higher, and the U.S. is no longer the only superpower in the room. If Washington keeps escalating, whether through a naval blockade, a no-fly zone, or a direct military strike, it won't just be facing Maduro's forces. It will be facing a coalition of adversaries, each with their own interests and their own red lines. Russia has already warned that any U.S. intervention would be met with a proportional response. China has called for restraint, but its state media has been far less diplomatic, framing the crisis as a U.S. plot to control Venezuela's resources. And Iran? It's already shown that it's willing to fight proxy wars in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Venezuela would be no different. This is the trap the US keeps walking into. It sees a problem, and it reaches for the military option because that's what it knows how to do. But the world has changed. The US can't just bomb its way to victory anymore. It can't sanction its way to compliance. And it can't ignore the fact that its adversaries are now playing the same game, with the same tools, and with far fewer constraints. So where does that leave us? The US has two choices. It can double down on the same failed policies, risking a wider war that could destabilize the entire region. Or it can do what it has refused to do, engage in real diplomacy, accept that the world is multipolar, and work with other powers to manage the crisis rather than trying to dictate the outcome. I know which path I'd choose. But I also know which path Washington is far more likely to take. And that's the real tragedy. Because in the end, the US isn't just repeating its mistakes, it's compounding them. And the bill for those mistakes will come due, sooner than anyone in Washington wants to admit. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a foreign policy blunder, it's a domestic political time bomb. The Biden administration, like its predecessors, is trapped in a cycle where Venezuela policy isn't really about Venezuela at all. It's about managing the expectations of a fractured American electorate, a Congress that swings between hawkish posturing and isolationist retreat, and a media ecosystem that rewards outrage over strategy. And right now, the White House is making the same mistake it made in Iraq, Libya, and assuming that if it just looks tough enough, the politics will sort themselves out. They won't. Let me explain why this matters. In 2024, Venezuela is a domestic issue in the US in a way it never was before. The migration crisis at the southern border has turned Maduro from an abstract villain into a tangible threat in the minds of millions of American voters. When Texas Governor Greg Abbott started busing migrants to Chicago and New York, he wasn't just making a point about federal immigration policy, he was forcing Venezuela into the living rooms of swing state voters. And when those voters see images of Venezuelan gangs like Tren de Aragua operating in U.S. cities, or hear about the 800% increase in Venezuelan asylum claims since 2019, they don't see a geopolitical chessboard. They see a direct threat. That's why you're hearing calls for a naval blockade from Republicans like Marco Rubio, who knows damn well that blockades are acts of war, but also knows that his base wants Maduro's head on a pike. Here's the uncomfortable: the Biden administration is caught between two impossible pressures. On one side, you have the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which has spent the last decade arguing that U.S. interventionism is the root of all evil in Latin America. Figures like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have been vocal about ending the sanctions regime, which they rightly point out has done nothing but immiserate the Venezuelan people while propping up Maduro's cronies. In 2021, when Biden briefly eased sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector in a bid to lower gas prices, progressives cheered. But when those same sanctions were reimposed after Maduro's sham election in July 2024, the left accused the White House of hypocrisy, of using Venezuela as a pawn in a domestic political game. On the other side, you have the hawks, both Republican and Democrat, who see Venezuela as a test of American resolve. They point to the 2019 Lima Group Declaration, where the U.S. and its allies recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's legitimate president, as proof that Maduro is a usurper who must be removed by any means necessary. Never mind that Guaidó's parallel government collapsed in 2021, leaving the U.S. with no viable alternative to Maduro. Never mind that the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, which included freezing Venezuela's gold reserves in the Bank of England and threatening secondary sanctions on any country that did business with Caracas, failed to dislodge the regime. The hawks don't care about results. They care about optics. And right now, the optics are terrible. This is where the domestic politics get really ugly. The Biden administration knows that if it backs down on Venezuela, it will be accused of weakness not just by Republicans, but by its own allies in Latin America. Colombia's President Gustavo Petro, a leftist who has tried to position himself as a mediator, has already warned that U.S. military action would turn Venezuela into another Iraq. But Petro's approval ratings are in the toilet, and his government is struggling to contain the spillover of Venezuelan migrants and armed groups. Meanwhile, Brazil's Lula da Silva, who has been trying to revive the idea of a negotiated solution, is facing his own domestic backlash from conservatives who see him as soft on dictators. If the US doesn't act, these leaders will be left holding the bag. If it does act, they'll be forced to pick sides in a conflict that could destabilize the entire continent. So what's the White House actually doing? The same thing it always trying to thread the needle. It's imposing targeted sanctions on Maduro's inner circle while quietly allowing Chevron and other US oil companies to maintain limited operations in Venezuela. It's funding opposition groups while refusing to recognize the 2024 election results as legitimate. It's sending mixed signals to the region, telling Petro and Lula that it supports dialogue, while letting Rubio and other hawks in Congress push for more aggressive measures. This isn't strategy. It's political triage. And here's the it's not working. Maduro knows he's playing a weak hand, but he also knows that the US is divided, distracted, and desperate. He's using that to his advantage. In August 2024, he announced a national dialogue with opposition factions, knowing full well that the US would have to engage with it or risk looking like the obstacle to peace. When the Biden administration sent a low-level delegation to the talks, Maduro got exactly what he a photo op that made him look like a statesman, not a dictator. Meanwhile, the sanctions regime remains in place, the Venezuelan economy is still in freefall, and the migration crisis continues to worsen. Let me be, this is not a failure of intelligence or even of will. It's a failure of imagination. The US foreign policy establishment is still operating under the assumption that if it just applies enough pressure, the other side will crack. But Maduro isn't Saddam Hussein. He's not even Nicolas Maduro from 2019. He's a survivor who has outlasted multiple US administrations, a global pandemic, and an economic collapse that should have ended his rule years ago. He's not going to fold because the US tightens the screws. He's going to dig in, and he's going to use every tool at his disposal, including the threat of a wider war, to stay in power. Now, let's talk about the scenarios that could actually play out. There are three, and none of them are good. The first is the status of frozen conflict where the US maintains sanctions, Maduro clings to power, and the Venezuelan people continue to suffer. This is the most likely outcome, and it's also the most politically convenient for the Biden administration. It allows them to claim they're doing something without actually having to do anything. The problem is that the status quo is unsustainable. Venezuela's oil production has already fallen to its lowest level in decades, and the country's infrastructure is on the verge of collapse. If the US doesn't ease sanctions, the humanitarian crisis will worsen, and the migration flow will only increase. If it does ease sanctions, it will be accused of capitulating to a dictator. Either way, the political fallout will be severe. The second scenario is escalation. This could take several a naval blockade to enforce the sanctions, a no-fly zone over Venezuelan airspace, or even a limited military strike against regime targets. The hawks in Congress are already pushing for this, and there's a real risk that the Biden administration could be boxed into a corner if Maduro does something provocative like arresting another US citizen, or allowing Russian or Iranian military assets into Venezuela. The problem with escalation is that it's a one-way street. Once the US crosses that line, it can't uncross it. And as we've seen in Syria and Ukraine, limited strikes have a way of spiraling into wider conflicts. The difference here is that Venezuela is in America's backyard. A US intervention would not just be a foreign policy disaster, it would be a domestic political catastrophe. Imagine the fallout if US troops start dying in Caracas, or if a naval blockade leads to a confrontation with Russian warships. The American public has no appetite for another forever war, and the backlash would be swift and brutal. The third scenario is the one no one in Washington wants to talk negotiation. Not the kind of performative diplomacy we've seen so far, where the US makes demands and Maduro makes empty promises. I'm talking about real, hard-nosed negotiations where both sides make painful concessions. For the US, that would mean accepting that Maduro isn't going anywhere in the short term and lifting some sanctions in exchange for free and fair elections down the line. For Maduro, it would mean allowing international observers, releasing political prisoners, and actually competing in a legitimate electoral process. The problem is that neither side trusts the other, and neither side has an incentive to blink first. The US doesn't want to reward Maduro's bad behavior, and Maduro doesn't want to give up the tools he uses to stay in power. This third scenario is the only one that has any chance of working. But it requires something that the US foreign policy establishment has lost the ability to think long term. Right now, the White House is focused on the 2024 election. Maduro is focused on surviving until 2025. Neither side is thinking about what Venezuela will look like in 2030. And that's the real tragedy. Because the longer this crisis drags on, the harder it will be to fix. I've spent enough time in Caracas and Washington to know that the people making these decisions aren't stupid. They're just trapped in a system that rewards short-term thinking and punishes nuance. The US has spent decades treating Latin America as a playground for its geopolitical ambitions, and now it's reaping what it sowed. Venezuela isn't just a failed state, it's a warning. A warning of what happens when great powers refuse to accept that the world has changed, and that their old playbook no longer works. The question now is whether anyone in Washington is willing to listen. I'm not holding my breath.